Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. And today we are starting a new book. We are starting Alice's Adventure in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. But first, reading updates. We finished a book last time. And I am still reading Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Um, Patreon book club is this Sunday. If you're interested, you still have a couple days to read it. It's not a terribly long book. It's under 300 pages, I think. Now that I say that, I don't know. But I'm reading it. I'm liking it. It is about this one woman, Janina, who lives in a very small town outside, or like in Poland, and murders are starting to happen, and she is convinced that she knows who is behind them, and she is sort of starting to insert herself into the investigation. And it's interesting. It's interesting. She's also very into astrology. And like her job of what she's doing right now, she used to be a professor. And so like she is translating William Blake poetry with somebody else who used to be her student, which is like super difficult, and they like talk about it and like trying to get like the feel, the like beauty of like rhyming things, and also um like the artistry by it, like the tone and all of that good stuff. Like word selection is just so interesting to me. And she is also taking care of people's houses, like people's like summer homes or whatever, while they're away, because it is currently winter in this book. And yeah, it's good. So far, so good. And I think that's all I'm reading. I do have two books that just arrived at the library for me. They're both manga. Blue Lock, which I watched the first two seasons of, I don't know, whatever is out. I've watched it and I'm obsessed and I need more. So I'm starting to read it. So I have the first volume of Blue Lock and I have the first volume of Spy Family, because I am also currently caught up on the anime of Spy Family, and I need more. I need more. So I feel like I can read them faster than the episodes come out. And I think that's it. I think that's it. Okay, let's mosey on over to Alice. Okay, so I did a ton of research, and I grabbed this from Wikipedia. So I thought we would do like a short little like behind the scenes type thing of Alice. Um, before reading the book. So let's just do it. Let's pretend that we did research and prepped for this. All right. So, Alice in Wonderland redirects here. So, there you go. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, commonly known as Alice in Wonderland, is an 1865 English children's novel by Lewis Carroll, a mathematician don at Oxford University. It details the story of a young girl named Alice who falls through a rabbit hole into a fantasy world of anthropomorphic creatures. Spoilers. It is seen as an example of the literary nonsense genre. The artist John Tenniel provided 42 wood engraved illustrations for the book. So the copy that I do have has those illustrations, so I'll just flip them around when we get to them. It'll be like story time, as if all of the other times that I've read for you were not like story time. It received positive reviews upon release and is now one of the best-known works of Victorian literature. Its narrative, structure, characters, and imagery have had a widespread influence on popular culture and literature, especially in the fantasy genre. It is credited as helping end an area of didacticism in children's literature, inaugurating an era in which writing for children aimed to delight or entertain. The tale plays with logic, giving the story lasting popularity with adults as well as children. The titular character, Alice, shares her name with Alice Liddell, a girl that Carol knew. The book has never been out of print and has been translated into 174 languages. Its legacy covers adaptations for screen, radio, art, ballet, opera, musicals, theme parks, board games, and video games. Carroll published a sequel in 1871 entitled Through the Looking Glass and shortened versions for young children, The Nursery Alice. So I also, in my copy, also have Through the Looking Glass. So once we finish Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we'll just keep the party going and hop into Through the Looking Glass. So, all right. Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. Preface. To the 86th thousand. Inquiries have been so often addressed to me as to whether any answer to the Hatter's riddle can be imagined, that I may as well put on record here what seems to me to be a fairly appropriate answer, because it can produce a few notes, though they are very flat, and it is never put with the wrong end in front. This, however, is merely an afterthought. The riddle, as originally invented, had no answer at all. That's cool. All in the golden afternoon, full leisurely we glide, for both our oars with little skill by little arms are plied, while little hands make vain pretense our wanderings to guide. Ah, cruel three, in such an hour, beneath such dreamy weather, to beg a tale of breath too weak to stir the tiniest feather. Yet what can one poor voice avail against 3 tongues together? Imperious Prima flashes forth her edict to begin it. In gentler tones Secunda hopes there will be nonsense in it, while Tertia interrupts the tale not more than once a minute. Anon to sudden silence one in fancy they pursue, the dream child moving through a land of wonders wild and new, in friendly chat with bird or beast, and half believe it true. And ever as the story drained the wells of fancy dry, and faintly strove that weary one to put the subject by. The rest next time, it is next time, the happy voices cry. Thus grew the vale of Wonderland, thus slowly, one by one, its quaint events were hammered out, and now the tale is done. And home we steer, a merry crew, beneath the setting sun. Alice a childish story take, and, with a gentle hand, lay it where childhood's dreams are twined, in memory's mystic band, like pilgrims' withered wreath of flowers plucked in a far-off land. Christmas greetings from a fairy to a child. Yet the hearts must childlike be, where such heavenly guests abide. Unto children in their glee all the year is Christmastide. Thus, forgetting tricks and play, for a moment, lady dear, we would wish you, if we may, Merry Christmas, glad New Year. And that was Christmas of 1867. Chapter 1. Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank, and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations on it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on. Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and, burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her and to wonder what was going to happen next. First, she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody underneath, so managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell past it. And we have a picture. There's the rabbit. Oh, the light. The lighting. But there's the rabbit. There's a little waistcoat and his little watch. So cute. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this, I shall think of nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll all think of me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it, even if I fell off the top of the house, which was very likely true. Down, down, down. Will the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see. That would be 4,000 miles down, I think. For, you see, Alice had learned several things of this sort in her lesson in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her, still, it was good practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance. But then I wonder what latitude and longitude I've got to. Alice had not the slightest idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but she thought they were nice grand words to say. Presently she began, I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny that'll seem to come among the people that walk with their heads downward. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word. But I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand? Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. Fancy, curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think of me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down. There was nothing else to do, so Alice soon began talking again. Dinah'll miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was the cat. And there's an asterisk here, a little footnote. The Liddells, so we learned that Alice is named after a real person, Alice Liddell. So the Liddells had a cat named Dinah. That's a fun fact. Now you can all wow your friends with that fact. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me. There are no mice in the air, I'm afraid, but you might catch a bat, and that's very like a mouse, you know. But do cats eat bats, I wonder? And here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself in a dreamy sort of way, Do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For, you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't much matter which way she put it. She felt that she was dozing off and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah, and was saying to her, very earnestly, "Now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat?" When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not a bit hurt, and she jumped up on her feet in a moment. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the White Rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and she was just in time to hear it say, as it turned a corner, "Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting!" She was close behind it when she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. She found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked, and when Alice had been all the way down one side and up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever going to get out again. Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it but a tiny golden key, and Alice's first idea was that this might belong to one of the doors on the hall. But alas, either the locks were too large or the key was too small, but at any rate it would not open any of them. However, on the second time around, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight, it fitted. Alice opened the door, and found it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat-hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains, but she could not even get her head through the doorway. "And even if my head would go through," thought poor Alice, "it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope! I think I could, if I only knew how to begin." For, you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the little door. So she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key on it, or at any rate a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. This time she found a little bottle on it, which certainly was not here before, said Alice, and tied round the neck of the bottle was a paper label with the words, "Drink me," beautifully printed on it in large letters. So there is a picture. There's Alice trying to get into the door. It was all very well to say, "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not." For she had read several nice little stories about children who had got burnt and eaten up by wild beasts, and other unpleasant things, all because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that, if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds. And she had never forgotten that, if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it is almost certain to disagree with you, sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it. And finding it very nice, it had, in fact, a sort of mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She very soon finished it off. And we have another picture of Alice with the bottle. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "It must be shutting up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into that lovely garden. First, However, she waited for a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this. For it might end, you know, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle looks like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. After a while, finding that nothing more happened, she decided on going into the garden at once. But alas, for poor Alice! When she got to the door, she found she had forgotten the little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass, and she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was too slippery. And when she had tired herself out with trying, the poor little thing sat down and cried. "Come, there's no use in crying like that," said Alice to herself rather sharply. "I advise you to leave off this minute." She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it. And sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her eyes, and once she remembered trying to box her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet, as she was playing against herself, for this curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people. But it's no use now, thought poor Alice, to pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me left to be one respectable person. Soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it, and found in it a very small cake, on which the words, "Eat me," were beautifully marked in currants. "Well, I'll eat it," said Alice, "and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door, so either way I'll get into the garden, and I don't care which happens." She ate a little bit, and said anxiously to herself, "Which way? Which way?" holding her hand on the top of her head to feel which way it was growing, and she was quite surprised that she remained the same size. To be sure, this was what generally happens when one eats cake, but Alice had got so much into the way of expecting nothing but out of the way things to happen, that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. So she set to work, and very soon finished off the cake. End of chapter 1. All right, so we have Alice, who is just really bored. Her sister is reading a book next to her, and the book doesn't have any pictures, it doesn't have any dialogue, and it's like, oh my god, this is so boring. So she's laying under a tree outside, and she sees a rabbit, and the rabbit is muttering to itself how he's late, and she doesn't think anything of it, and then the rabbit pulls out a watch from his little waistcoat, and she's like, okay, well, maybe that's a little bit odd. And so she follows the rabbit, and the rabbit goes into a hole, and so she falls into the hole, and the hole she's just falling and falling and falling, miles and miles and miles. And there's like so many odd things that are just like passing by her as she's doing all of this. And then she lands finally, and she comes across this place that has a door, and she can't get through the door. Well, she finds the key, she tries the key into the door, and it works finally, because there's several doors that she's tried and it didn't work. So that's the one that works, but she can't fit in. She can only fit her head through. She's like, oh, if only I was a telescope and I could go and fold myself in. And so then appears a drink on the table, and it says, drink me. And she's like, well, it doesn't say poison, so it's okay. So I'm going to drink this mysterious liquid. So she drinks it, and she shrinks, and she shrinks, and she gets real, real small. And so then she's like, yes, now I can get through the door. And she goes over there, and she doesn't have the key. And she's like, oh, crap, I don't have the key. So then a little box appears, and inside the box are little cakes that say, eat me. And she's like, all right, well, I'm going to eat it because it's telling me to. And either I'm going to get big, or I'm going to get really small. Either way, I'll be able to either get the key if I get big, or I'll just shimmy underneath the door if I get any smaller. And so she's eating the cake. She takes a bite and nothing happens. And so she just eats the whole cake. And that's where we ended. Chapter 2. The Pool of Tears. Curiouser and curiouser, said Alice. She was so much surprised that for the moment she quite forgot how to speak good English. Now I'm opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Good-bye, feet. For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight. They were getting so far off. Oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears. I'm sure I shan't be able to. I shall be a great deal far too off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best you can. But I must be kind to them, thought Alice, or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas. And she went on planning to herself how she would manage it. They must go by the carrier, she thought, and how funny it'll seem, sending presents to one's own feet, and how odd the directions will look. Alice's right foot, Esquire. Hearthrug near the fender, with Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense am I talking? Just at this moment, her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now rather more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the golden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look through the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "A great girl like you. She might well say thus. To go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you." But she went on all the same, shedding gallows of tears, until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep, and reaching half down the hall. After a time she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit, returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry, muttering to himself as he did, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask help of anyone. So, when the rabbit came near her, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit started violently, dropped the white kid gloves and the fan, and scurried away into the darkness as hard as he could go. Alice took up the fan and gloves, and as the hall was very hot, she kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking. "Dear, dear, how odd everything is today, and yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night. Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? And that's the great puzzle." And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were of the same age as herself, to see if she could have changed into any of them. We have 2 pictures on this page. We have this one, where she's gotten real tall. That is a mighty neck. And then we have this one, where she is large. And there goes the White Rabbit, running right past. "I'm sure I'm not Ada," she said, "for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all. And I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and she knows such very little. Besides, she's she, and I'm I, and oh dear, how puzzling it all is. I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12. 4 times 6 is 13. 4 times 7 is... Oh dear, I shall never get to 20 at this rate. However, the multiplication table doesn't signify. Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome, and Rome... No, that's all wrong, I'm certain. I must have changed for Mabel. I'll try and say, how doth the little... And she crossed her hands on her lap, as if she were saying lessons, and began to repeat it. But her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come out the same as they used to do. "How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale. How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. I'm sure those are not the right words, said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house and have next to no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. I'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, "Come up again, dear." I shall only look up and say, "Who am I, then? Tell me that first, and then, if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else. But oh dear," cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears, "I do wish they would put their heads down. I'm so very tired of being all alone here." As she said this, she looked down at her hands, and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white kid gloves while she was talking. "How can I have done that?" she thought. "I must be growing small again." She got up and went to the table to measure herself by it, and found that, as nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high, and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of all this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to save herself from shrinking away altogether. "That was a narrow escape," said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. "And now for the garden." And she ran with all speed back to the little door. But alas! The little door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. "And things are worse than ever," thought the poor child, "for I never was so small as this before, never, and I declare it's too bad that it is." As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash! She was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea. "And in that case I can go back to the railway," she said to herself. Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that, wherever you go to on the English coast, you find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of lodging-houses, and behind them a railway station. However, she soon made out that she was in the pool of tears which she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, as she swam about, trying to find her way out. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. That will be an odd thing for sure. However, everything is odd today." Just then she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first she thought it must be a walrus or hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was, and she soon made out that it was only a mouse that had slipped in like herself. "Would it be of any use now," thought Alice, "to speak to the mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here that I should think very likely it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying." So she began, "Oh, Mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I'm very tired of swimming about here. Oh, Mouse!" Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse. She had never done such a thing before, but she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar a mouse, of a mouse, to a mouse, oh, mouse. The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to her to wink with one of its little eyes, but said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." For with all her knowledge of history, Alice had no very clear notion how long ago anything had happened. So she began again, "Où est ma chatte?" which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. And she's just asking for a translation. Where is my cat? The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fear. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "Not like cats?" cried the mouse in a shrill, passionate voice. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "Don't be angry about it. And yet I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd take a fancy to cats if you could only see her. She is such a dear, quiet thing," Alice went on, half to herself, as she swam lazily about the pool. "And she sits purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face, and she is such a nice, soft thing to nurse. And she's such a capital one for catching mice. Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. "We won't talk about her any more if you'd rather not." "We, indeed!" cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of its tail. "As if I would talk on a subject. Our family always hated cats. Nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear the name again." "I won't indeed," said Alice in a great hurry to change the subject of conversation. "Are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. "There is such a nice little dog near our house. I should like to show you. A little bright-eyed terrier, you know, with, oh, such long curly brown hair, and it'll fetch things when you throw them, and it'll sit up and beg for its dinner, and all sorts of things. I can't remember half of them, and it belongs to a farmer, you know, and he says it's so useful, it's worth £100. He says it kills all the rats, and oh dear," cried Alice in a sorrowful tone, "I'm afraid I've offended it again." For the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as it could go, and making quite a commotion in the pool as it went. And there's a picture of Alice and the mouse. How cute! So she called after, "Mouse, dear, do come back again, and we won't talk about cats, or dogs either, if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, it turned round and swam slowly back to her. Its face was quite pale, with passion, Alice thought, and it said in a low, trembling voice, "Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with the birds and animals that had fallen into it. There was a duck and a dodo, a lory and an eaglet, and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore. End of chapter 2. All right, so chapter 2. Alice is extremely big. And she's fretting about how she is going to ever put shoes on her feet. And the white rabbit runs by at this moment, and she's like, "Oh, the white rabbit will obviously help me." And so she calls out to the white rabbit, but the white rabbit is startled and drops both his gloves and his fan. And Alice picks them up and starts fanning herself because it's very hot in there. And she is talking and starts crying, and all hope is lost because she can't get out, and she's just imagining this whole life, and she's like, "Oh, everything is so weird today. I must be somebody else." And so she's trying to think of like, well, maybe I'm Mabel. Mabel's kind of dumb, but I'm not dumb. And then so she's like talking through the things that she knows, and she's like, wait, this is all wrong. Maybe I am Mabel. And she's like, oh, I wish that somebody would like poke their head down into this hole, and like they would be able to tell me who I am. And if it's somebody that I don't want to be, then I'll just stay down here until I'm somebody that I want to be. And while this is going on, she is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because of the fan, and she doesn't realize it. And now she's only like this big, and she's flashing into her tears that she has cried, which is basically like seawater now. And there's a mouse that's swimming by, and she's like, "Oh, maybe the mouse will help me." And she is terrible at trying to get the mouse to help her. And she's like, "Oh, I love my cat. My cat's great." And the mouse is like, "I hate cats." And she's like, "Oh, well, there's a dog by us, and this dog is great." And the mouse is like, "I hate dogs." And so things are starting to get a little torrential. And so they're going to swim to shore. And as they're swimming to shore, we're noticing that there's a lot of different animals that have fallen into the hole, like a dodo bird and an eaglet and all of these things. And they're all swimming to shore. And now the mouse is going to tell us why no like the dogs and the cats. Because apparently, whole family doesn't like the dogs and the cats. So we're going to get a little history. Love it. Let's do it. Chapter 3. A caucus, race, and a long tail. They were indeed an odd-looking party that assembled on the bank. The birds with draggled feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross, and uncomfortable. First question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this, and after a few minutes it seemed quite natural to Alice to find herself talking familiarly with them, as if she had known them all her life. Indeed, she had quite a long argument with the Lory, who was last turned sulky, and would only say, "I'm older than you, and must know better." And this Alice would not allow, without knowing how old it was, and as the Lory positively refused to tell its age, there was no more to be said. At last, the mouse, who seemed to be a person of some authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once in a large ring, and the mouse in the middle. Alice kept her eyes anxiously fixed on it, for she felt sure she would catch a bad cold if she did not get dry very soon. Said the mouse with an impatient air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please. William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders, and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria—" "Ugh," said the Lory, with a shiver. "I beg your pardon," said the mouse, frowning, but very politely. "Did you speak?" "Not I," said the Lory, hastily. "I thought you did," said the mouse. "I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable—" "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," the mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course you know what it means?" "I know what it means well enough. What I find a thing," said the duck, "it's generally a frog or a worm. The question is what the Archbishop found." The mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. "Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans— How are you getting on, my dear?" it continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "Doesn't seem to dry me at all." "In that case," said the dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the dodo in an off-handed tone, "was that the best thing to get us dry would to be a caucus race." "What is a caucus race?" said Alice. Not that she much wanted to know, but the dodo had paused as if it thought that somebody ought to speak, and no one seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And as you might like to try the thing yourself some winter day, I will tell you how the dodo managed it. First, it marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, it said. And then all the party was placed along the course here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3, and away, but they began running when they liked, and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so, and were quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over!" And they all crowded round it, panting and asking, "But who has won?" This question the dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and it stood for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him, while the rest waited in silence, as the dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." "But who is to give the prizes?" quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she is, of course," said the dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger, and the whole party at once crowded around her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes! Prizes!" Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair she put her hand in her pocket and pulled out a box of comfits, luckily the salt water had not gotten into any, and handed them round as prizes. There was exactly one apiece all round. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the mouse. "Of course." "Of course," the dodo replied very gravely. "What else have you got in your pocket?" it went on, turning to Alice. "Only a thimble," said Alice sadly. "Hand it over here," said the dodo. Then they all crowded round her once more, while the dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." And when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare to laugh, and, as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble, looking as solemn as she could. The next thing was to eat the comfits. This caused some noise and confusion, as the large birds complained that they could not taste theirs, and the small ones choked and had to be patted on the back. However, it was over at last, and they sat down again in a ring, and begged the mouse to tell them something more. "You promised to tell me your history, you know," said Alice. "And why is it that you hate C and D?" she added in a whisper, half afraid that it would offend the mouse. It would be offended again. "Mine is a long and sad tale," said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. "It is a long tale, certainly," said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail. "But why do you call it sad?" And she kept on puzzling about it while the mouse was speaking, so that her idea of the tale was something like this. I'm going to show you the page. I'm going to read it, but I want you to see what it looks like. Oh, you can't! Oh, this dang tootin' light. Ah! Okay, maybe a little bit. So the way that the words are written, maybe I can do it this way. No, that was silly. Why would you think that you could share it this way? The way that the words are written is like... Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have the trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do," said the mouse to the cur. "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury or judge, would be wasting our breath." "I'll be judge, I'll be jury," said the cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death." "You are not attending," said the mouse to Alice severely. "What are you thinking?" "Oh, I beg your pardon," said Alice very humbly. "You had got to the fifth bend, I think?" "I had not." cried the mouse sharply and very angrily. A knot? Said Alice, always ready to make herself useful and looking anxiously about her. Oh, do let me help you undo it. Do let me help you undo it. I shall do nothing of the sort, said the mouse, getting up and walking away. You insult me by talking such nonsense. Oh, I didn't mean it, pleaded poor Alice, but you're so easily offended, you know. The mouse only growled in reply. Please come back and finish your story, Alice called after it, and the others all joined in chorus. Yes, please do. But the mouse only shook its head impatiently and walked a little quicker. What a pity it wouldn't stay, sighed the Lory, as soon as it was quite out of sight, and an old crab took the opportunity to say to her daughter, Ah, my dear, let this be a lesson to you never to use your temper. Hold your tongue, ma, said the young crab a little snappishly. You're enough to try the patience of an oyster. Oh, I wish I had our Dinah here. I know I do, said Alice aloud, addressing nobody in particular. She'd soon fetch it back. And who is Dinah, if I might venture to ask the question? Asked the Lory. Alice replied eagerly, for she was always ready to talk about her pet. Dinah's our cat, and she's such a capital one for catching mice, you can't think, and oh, I wish you could see her after the birds. Why, she'll eat a little bird as soon as look at it. This speech caused a remarkable sensation among the party. Some of the birds hurried off at once. One old magpie began wrapping itself up very carefully, remarking, I really must be getting home. The night air doesn't suit my throat. And a canary called out in a trembling voice to its children, Come away, my dears, it's high time we were all off to bed. On various pretexts, they all moved off, and Alice was soon left alone. I wish I hadn't mentioned Dinah, she said to herself in a melancholy tone. Nobody seems to like her down here, and I'm sure she's the best cat in our world. Oh, my dear Dinah, I wonder if I'll ever see you any more. And here poor Alice began to cry again, for she felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she again heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance, and she looked up eagerly, half hoping that the mouse had changed his mind and was coming back to finish his story. And here is the dodo bird and Alice and all the other little birds. I love that Alice immediately is like, oh, I know how to ruin this cute moment. Let me bring my cat into it. Not only does my cat hunt mice, but birds, as she's surrounded by birds, and all the birds are like, all right, let's go. Here we go. End of chapter 3. All right, so they swam all over to the shore, and they're all wet from being in the water, and so they're like, what do we do to dry off? And so the mouse is like, I know exactly how to dry off. I will say the driest thing that I know, and then starts going off on history, which is hilarious because, I mean, sometimes history is really exciting, but like, it's so funny, and I love it. And nobody's really getting dry, and so the dodo is like, we need to do a caucus race. And they're like, okay, well, what's that? And it's like, oh, okay, I will show you. And so, like, draws out a big circle, which isn't really like a circle, like, it's not a perfect shape at all. And instead of being like, all right, 1, 2, 3, go, everybody just starts running. There's no real start or end. And people, like, stop when they want to and start when they want to. And so, like, after 30 minutes, the dodo bird is like, all right, that's it. And people are like, okay, but like, who won? Who won this caucus race? And the bird's like, everybody. Everybody won. And they're like, well, where's our prize? And he's like, who's supposed to bring the prize? And it's like, well, Alice has the prizes and gonna give it to us. And Alice is like, what? And so she reaches in her pockets and she has these like comfits and a little thimble. And the little thimble goes to her, and the dodo like blesses or gives thanks for all of these prizes. And Alice is like, wait, no, we need to hear your story, mouse. And so the mouse starts telling the story, and Alice, of course, gets distracted and is misinterpreting things that the mouse is saying. And so the mouse just kind of like leaves because she starts talking, nonsense. The mouse leaves and she's like, "Oh, if only my cat were here. Like, my cat is really good at catching mice and, like, would absolutely have caught the mouse and brought him back. Oh my gosh, my cat is so good at also catching birds." And all the birds are like nervous, like, "Ooh." They turn into Dangerfield. Ooh. And then they just leave. And that's the end of chapter 3. All right. Chapter 4. The rabbit sends in a little bill. It was the white rabbit, trotting slowly back again, and looking anxiously about as it went, as if it had lost something. And she heard it muttering to itself, "Oh, Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, my dear paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers! She'll get me executed, as sure as ferrets are ferrets! Where can I have dropped them, I wonder?" Alice guessed in a moment that it was looking for the fan and the pair of white kid gloves, and she very good-naturedly began hunting about for them, but they were nowhere to be seen. Everything seemed to have changed since her swim in the pool, and the great hall, with the glass table and the little door, had vanished completely. Very soon the rabbit noticed Alice as she went hunting about, and called out to her in an angry tone. "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing out here? Run home this moment, and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Quick now!" And Alice was so much frightened that she ran off at once in the direction of it was pointing to, without trying to explain the mistake that it had made. "He took me for his housemaid," said Alice to herself as she ran. "How surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. But I'd better take him his fan and gloves, that is, if I can find them." And as she said this, she came upon a neat little house, on the door of which was a bright plate with the name W. Rabbit engraved upon it. She went in without knocking, and hurried upstairs in great fear lest she should meet the real Mary Ann, and be turned out of the house before she had found the fan and gloves. "How odd it seems," said Alice to herself, "to be going messages for a rabbit. I suppose Dinah'll be sending me on messages next." And she began fancying the sort of things that would happen. "Miss Alice, come here directly, and get ready for your walk." "Coming in a minute, nurse. I've got to watch this mouse hole till Dinah comes back, and see that the mouse doesn't get out. Only I don't think," Alice went on, "that they'd let Dinah stop in the house if it began ordering people around like that." By this time she had found her way into a tidy little room with a table in the window, and on it, as she had hoped, a fan and 2 or 3 pairs of tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and a pair of gloves, and was just going to leave the room when her eye fell upon a little bottle that stood near the looking-glass. There was no label this time, with the words "Drink me," but nevertheless she uncorked it and put it to her lips. "I know something interesting is sure to happen," she said to herself, "whenever I eat or drink anything, so I'll just see what this little bottle does. I do hope it'll make me grow large again, for really I'm quite tired of being such a tiny little thing." It did so, indeed, and much sooner than she had expected. Before she had drunk half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling, and had to stoop to save her neck from being broken. She hastily put down the bottle, saying to herself, "That's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow much more. As it is, I can't get out of the door. I do wish I hadn't drunk quite so much." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing, and growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor in another minute. There was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other arm curled round her head. Still she went on growing, and, as a last resource, she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney, and said to herself, Now I can do no more. Whatever happens, what will become of me?" Luckily for Alice, the little magic bottle had now had its full effect, and she grew no larger. Still, it was very uncomfortable, and as there seemed to be no sort of change of her ever getting out of the room again, no wonder she felt unhappy. It was much pleasanter at home, thought poor Alice, when one wasn't going larger and smaller and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. I almost wish I hadn't gone down that rabbit hole, and yet, it's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought, and when I grow up I'll write one. But I'm grown up now," she added, in a sorrowful tone. "At least there's no room to grow up any more here." "But then," thought Alice, "shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort, one way, never to be an old woman, but then always to have lessons to learn. Oh, I shouldn't like that." "Oh, you foolish Alice," she answered herself. "How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for lesson books." And so she went on, taking first one side, then the other, and making quite a conversation of it altogether. But after a few minutes she heard a voice and stopped to listen. Here's a picture of Alice getting big in the little house. "Mary Ann! Mary Ann!" said the voice. "Fetch me my gloves this moment." Then came a little pattering of feet on the stairs. Alice knew it was the White Rabbit coming to look for her, and she trembled till she shook the house, quite forgetting that she was now about 1,000 times as large as the rabbit, and had no reason to be afraid of it. Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but as the door opened inwards, and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it, that attempt proved a failure. Alice heard it say to itself, "I'll go round and get it in at the window." "That you won't," thought Alice, and after waiting till she fancied she heard the rabbit just under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She did not get hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall, and a crash of broken glass, from which she concluded that it was just possible it had fallen into a cucumber frame, or something of the sort. Cucumber frame meaning a small building that resembles a greenhouse. Next came an angry voice, the rabbit's. "Pat, Pat, where are you?" And then a voice she had never heard before. "Sure then I'm here, digging for apples, your honor." "Digging for apples, indeed," said the rabbit angrily. "Here, come and help me out of this." Sounds of more broken glass. "Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "Sure, it's an arm, your honor." He pronounced it arum. "An arm, you goose! Who ever saw that size? Why, it fills the whole window." "Sure it does, your honor, but it's an arm for all that." "Well, it's got no business there, at any rate. Go and take it away." There was a long silence after this, and Alice could only hear whispers now and then, such as, "Sure, I don't like it, your honor, at all, at all." "Do as I tell you, you coward." And at last she spread out her hand again and made another snatch in the air. This time there were 2 little shrieks and more sounds of broken glass. What a number of cucumber fences there must be, thought Alice. I wonder what they'll do next. As for pulling me out of the window, I only wish they could. I'm sure I don't want to stay in here any longer. She waited for some time without hearing anything more. At last came a rumbling of little cartwheels, and the sound of a good many voices all talking together. She made out the words. "Where's the other ladder?" "Why, I hadn't to bring one." Bill's got the other. Bill, fetch it here, lad. Here, put 'em at this corner. No, no, tie 'em together first. They don't reach half high enough yet. Well, they'll do well enough. Ah, don't be so particular. Here, Bill, catch hold of this rope. Will the roof bear? Bind the loose slate. Oh, it's coming down. Heads below! Loud crash. That was a terrible crash sound effect. Now, who did that? It was Bill, I fancy. Who's got down the chimney? Oh, I shan't. Shan't? You do it. That I won't. Bill's got up there. Here, Bill. The matter says you've got to go down the chimney. Oh, so Bill's got to come down the chimney, has he? Said Alice to herself. Why, they seem to put everything upon Bill. I wouldn't be in Bill's place for a good deal. This fireplace is narrow, to be sure, but I think I can kick a little. She drew her foot as far down the chimney as she could, and waited till she heard a little animal, she couldn't guess of what sort it was, scratching and scrambling about in the chimney close above her, then saying to herself, "This is Bill." She gave one sharp kick, and waited to see what would happen next. The first thing she heard was a general chorus of, "There goes Bill!" Then the rabbit's voice alone, "Catch him, you, by the hedge!" and silence. And then another confusion of voices, "Hold up, head! Brandy now, don't choke him! How was it, old fellow? What happened to you? Tell us all about it!" Last came a little, feeble, squeaking voice. "That's Bill," thought Alice. "Well, I hardly know. No more, thank you. I'm better now, but I'm a deal too flustered to tell you. All I know is something comes at me like a jack-in-the-box, and up I goes like a skyrocket." "So you did, old fellow," said the others. "We must burn the house down," said the rabbit's voice, and Alice called out as loud as she could, "If you do, I'll set Dinah on you." There was a dead silence instantly, and Alice thought to herself, "I wonder what they will do next. If they had any sense, they'd take the roof off." After a minute or two they began moving about again, and Alice heard the rabbit say, "A barrowful will do, to begin with." A barrowful of what? thought Alice, but she had not long to doubt, for the next moment a shower of little pebbles came rattling in at the windows, and some of them hit her in the face. "I'll put a stop to this," she said to herself, and shouted out, "You'd better not do that again," which produced another dead silence. Alice noticed with some surprise that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes as they lay on the floor, and a bright idea came into her head. "If I eat one of these cakes," she thought, "it's sure to make some change in my size, and as it can't possibly make me larger, it must make me smaller, I suppose." So she swallowed one of the cakes, and was delighted to find that she began shrinking directly. As soon as she was small enough to get through the door, she ran out of the house, and found quite a crowd of little animals and birds waiting outside. The poor little lizard, Bill, was in the middle, being held up by 2 guinea pigs, who were giving it something out of a bottle. They all made a rush at Alice the moment she appeared, but she ran off as hard as she could, and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. It's a picture of Bill being shot out of the chimney. Poor Bill. Poor little Bill. "The first thing I've got to do," said Alice to herself as she wandered about the wood, "is to grow to my right size again. And the second thing is to find my way into that lovely garden. I think that will be the best plan." It sounded an excellent plan, no doubt, and very neatly and simply arranged. The only difficulty was that she had not the smallest idea how to set about it, and, while she was peering anxiously about among the trees, a little sharp bark just over her head made her look up in a great hurry. An enormous puppy was looking down at her with large round eyes and feebly stretching out one paw, trying to touch her. "Oh, poor little thing," said Alice in a coaxing voice, and she tried hard to whistle to it. But she was terribly frightened all the time at the thought that it might be hungry, in which case it would be very likely to eat her up in spite of all her coaxing. Hardly knowing what she did, she picked up a little bit of stick and held it out to the puppy, whereupon the puppy jumped into the air off all its feet at once with a yelp of delight, and rushed at the stick and made believe to worry it. Then Alice dodged behind a great thistle to keep herself from being run over, and the moment she appeared on the other side, the puppy made another rush at the stick and tumbled head over heels in its hurry to get hold of it. Then Alice, thinking it was very like having a game of play with a cart horse, and expecting every moment to be trampled under its feet, ran round the thistle again. Then the puppy began a series of short charges at the stick, running a very little way forwards each time, and a long way back, and barking hoarsely all the while, till at last it sat down a good way off, panting with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, and its great eyes half shut. This seemed to Alice a good opportunity for making her escape, so she set off at once, and ran till she was quite tired and out of breath, until the puppy's bark sounded quite faint in the distance. There's a picture of the puppy, and Alice is over here poking it with a stick. And yet, what a dear little puppy it was, said Alice, as she leant a buttercup to rest herself, and fanned herself with one of the leaves. I should have liked teaching it tricks very much if I'd only been the right size to do it. Oh dear, I'd nearly forgotten that I've got to grow again. Let me see. How is it to be managed? I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other, but the great question is, what? The great question certainly was, what? Alice looked all round her at the flowers and the blades of grass, but she could not see anything that looked like the right thing to eat or drink under the circumstances. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as herself, and when she had looked under it, and on both sides of it, and behind it, it occurred to her that she might as well look and see what was on top of it. She stretched herself up on tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met with those of a large blue caterpillar that was sitting on the top, with its arms folded, quietly smoking a long hookah, and taking not the smallest notice of her or anything else. End of chapter 4. All right, so chapter 4. The White Rabbit comes back and is looking for his gloves and his fan, which we know that he dropped when he ran off because Alice was so big and scary. And Alice is like looking around, doesn't see it, and he's like, "Ah, Marianne, go get my hat, or go get my gloves and my fan." And Alice is like, "Oh no, he thinks I'm Marianne. He thinks I'm his housemaid." Well, I mean, I want him to have his gloves and his hat. So she runs off to his house, which is marked with a plaque that's just W Rabbit, which is great, and goes in there and finds them. And she grabs them and she's about to leave, but then she sees something that says, "Drink me." And it doesn't say what it is. So, of course, she does. And she gets massive. She just is expanding in this house to the point where she does not fit. She does not fit. And so the White Rabbit comes back and is like, "Ah, Marianne, Marianne," and he like can't get through the door because her elbow is blocking it. And so he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go through the window," and he can't get through the window. And so neighbors are starting to gather round, and Bill, they send Bill in through the chimney because he's really skinny. So they send Bill in through the chimney, and Alice is like, "Oh my gosh, she's sending through the chimney." So she kicks and flings Bill, who is a lizard, out of the chimney. and she can hear snippets of conversation outside about like what they're gonna do, and they're like, a barrel full, and she's like, a barrel full of what? And then they get quiet, and then they start like throwing things, and they're like plopping down next to her, and she picks one up, and it's a little cookie, and it says eat me, so she eats it, and she just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and she's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and too small once again, and she gets out of the house, and they're all just like, what are you doing? Who are you? Like all of these things, and she runs away, and just keeps running until she feels like she's in a safe space. And then she hears a really sharp, loud bark, and she looks up, and it's a puppy. And she's trying to play with the puppy but can't really do it. And she's like, oh my gosh, what if the puppy is hungry and the puppy's gonna eat me? So she runs away until the puppy is just like a faint bark in the distance. And she's looking around for something to eat or drink to help her get to the right size. And nothing really looks like it would do that in this circumstance. And she comes upon a really large mushroom, and she's looking all around the mushroom, and then she stands up on tippy toes, and she sees the big blue caterpillar. And that's where we ended the chapter. All right. Our blue caterpillar. Chapter 5. Advice from a caterpillar. The caterpillar and Alice looked at each other for some time in silence. At last, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and addressed her in a languid, sleepy voice. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then. What do you mean by that? Said the caterpillar sternly. Explain yourself. Well, I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself, you see. I don't see, said the caterpillar. I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, Alice replied very politely, for I can't understand it myself to begin with, and being so many different sizes in a day is very confusing. It isn't, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet, said Alice. But when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will some day, you know, and then after that into a butterfly. I should think you'll feel a little odd, won't you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps your feelings may be different, said Alice. All I know is, it would be very odd to me. Okay, something that I meant to mention before, the way that contractions are written in this is different. So like won't, W-O-N apostrophe T, is spelled W-O apostrophe N apostrophe T. And then can't is C-A apostrophe N apostrophe T. And I just think that's interesting. I wanted to share that and forgot to do that earlier. Just fun little literary things. You, said the caterpillar contemptuously. Who are you? Which brought them back again to the beginning of the conversation. Alice felt a little irritated at the caterpillar's making such very short remarks, and she drew herself up and said very gravely, I think you ought to tell me who you are first. Why? Said the caterpillar. Here was another puzzling question, and as Alice could not think of any good reason, and the caterpillar seemed to be in a very unpleasant state of mind, she turned away. Come back, said the caterpillar called after her. I've got something important to say. This sounded promising, certainly. Alice turned and came back. Keep your temper, said the caterpillar. Is that all? Said Alice, swallowing down her anger as well as she could. No, said the caterpillar. Alice thought she might as well wait, as she had nothing else to do, and perhaps, after all, it might tell her something worth hearing. For some minutes it puffed away without speaking, but at last it unfolded its arms, took the hookah out of its mouth again, and said, "So, you think you're changed, do you?" "Oh, I'm afraid I am, sir," said Alice. "I can't remember things as I used, and I don't keep the same size for 10 minutes together." "Can't remember what things?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I've tried to say, 'How doth the little busy bee?' but it all came different," Alice replied in a very melancholy voice. "Repeat, 'You are old, Father William,'" said the caterpillar. Alice folded her hands and began. "You are old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right?" And we have two pictures. We have the caterpillar up on his little mushroom, and then we have old William, which the light hates, there we go, on his head. "In my youth, Father William replied to his son, I feared it might injure the brain. But now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again." "You are old," said the youth, "as I mentioned before, and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that?" "In my youth," said the sage, as he shook his grey locks, "I kept all my limbs very supple. But by the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box, allow me to sell you a couple." "You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" "In my youth," said the father, "I took to the law, and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life." "You are old," said the youth. "One would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever?" "I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough," said his father. "Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs." And we have 2 pictures again, doing the somersault into the house, and then eating the goose with the bones and the beak. "That is not right," said the caterpillar. "Not quite right, I'm afraid," said Alice timidly. "Some of the words have gotten altered." "It is wrong from beginning to end," said the caterpillar decidedly, and there was silence for some minutes. The caterpillar was the first to speak. "What size do you want to be?" it asked. "Oh, I'm not particular as to the size," Alice hastily replied. "Only one doesn't like changing so often, you know." "I don't know," said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her life before, and she felt that she was losing her temper. "Are you content now?" said the caterpillar. "Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind," said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be." "It is a very good height, indeed," said the caterpillar angrily, rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. "But I'm not used to it," pleaded Alice, in a piteous tone, and she thought to herself, "I wish the creatures wouldn't be so easily offended." "You'll get used to it in time," said the caterpillar, and it put the hookah into its mouth and began smoking again. This time Alice waited patiently until it chose to speak again. In a minute or two the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and yawned once or twice and shook itself. Then it got down off the mushroom and crawled away into the grass, merely remarking as it went, "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter." One side of what? The other side of what? Thought Alice to herself. Of the mushroom, said the caterpillar, just as if she had asked aloud, and in another moment it was out of sight. Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a minute, trying to make out which were the two sides of it, and as it was perfectly round, she found this a very difficult question. However, at last she stretched her arms round it as far as they would go, and broke off a bit of the edge of each hand. "And now, which is which?" she said to herself, and nibbled a little of the right hand bit to try the effect. The next moment she felt a violent blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. She was a good deal frightened by this very sudden change, but she felt that there was no time to be lost. She was sinking rapidly. So she set to work at once to eat some of the other bit. Her chin was pressed so closely against her foot that there was hardly room to open her mouth, but she did at last, and managed to swallow a morsel of the left-hand bit. "Come, my hand's free at last," said Alice, in a tone of delight, which changed into alarm in another moment, when she found that her shoulders were nowhere to be found. All she could see, when she looked down, was an immense length of neck, which seemed to rise like a stalk out of a sea of green leaves that lay far below her. "What can all that green stuff be?" said Alice. "And where have my shoulders got to? And oh, my poor hands, how is it I can't see you?" She was moving them about as she spoke, but no result seemed to follow, except a little shaking among the distant green leaves. As there seemed to be no chance of getting her hands up to her head, she tried to get her head down to them, and was delighted to find that her neck would bend about easily in any direction, like a serpent. She had just succeeded in curving it down into a graceful zigzag, and was going to dive in among the leaves, which she found to be nothing but the tops of the trees under which she had been wandering, when a sharp hiss made her draw back in a hurry, and a large pigeon had flown into her face and was beating her violently with its wings. "Serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I am not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Let me alone." "Serpent, I say again," repeated the pigeon, but in a more subdued tone, and added, with a kind of sob, "I've tried every way, but nothing seems to suit them." "Haven't the least idea what you're talking about," said Alice. "I've tried the roots of trees, and I've tried the banks, I've tried hedges," the pigeon went on without attending to her, "but those serpents, there's no pleasing them." Alice was more and more puzzled, but she thought there was no use in saying anything more till the pigeon had finished. "As if it wasn't trouble enough hatching the eggs," said the pigeon, "but I must be on the lookout for serpents night. Why, I haven't had a wink of sleep these 3 weeks." "I'm very sorry you've been annoyed," said Alice, who was beginning to see its meaning. "And just as I'd taken the highest tree in the wood," continued the pigeon, raising its voice to a shriek, "and just as I was thinking I would be free at last, they must needs come wriggling down from the sky. Oh, sir!" "But I'm not a serpent, I tell you," said Alice. I'm a "Well, what are you, then?" said the pigeon. "I can't see you trying to invent something." I'm a little girl," said Alice rather doubtfully, as she remembered the number of changes she had gone through that day. "A likely story, indeed," said the pigeon, in a tone of the deepest contempt. "I've seen a good many little girls in my time, but never one with such a neck as that. No, no, you're a serpent, and there's no use denying it. I suppose you'll be telling me next that you've never tasted an egg." Oh, I have tasted eggs, certainly, said Alice, who was a very truthful child. But little girls eat eggs quite as much as serpents do, you know? I don't believe it, said the pigeon. But if they do, why, then they're a kind of serpent. That's all I can say. This was such a new idea to Alice that she was quite silent for a minute or two, which gave the pigeon the opportunity of adding, "You're looking for eggs. I know that well enough. And that does it ma- and what does it matter to me whether you're a little girl or a serpent?" "Well, it matters a good deal to me," said Alice hastily. "But I'm not looking for eggs, as it happens, and if I was, I shouldn't want yours. I don't like them raw." "Well, be off then," said the pigeon in a sulky tone, as it settled down again into its nest. Alice crouched down among the trees as well as she could, for her neck kept getting entangled among the branches, and every now and then she had to stop and untwist it. After a while she remembered that she still had the pieces of mushroom in her hands, and she set to work very carefully, nibbling first at one and then the other, and growing sometimes taller and sometimes shorter, until she had succeeded in bringing herself down to her usual height. It was so long since she had been anything near the right size that it felt quite strange at first, but she got used to it in a few minutes, and began talking to herself as usual. "Come, there's half my plan now. How puzzling all these changes are! I'm never sure if I'm going to be, from one minute to another. However, I've got back to my right size. The next thing is to get into that beautiful garden. How is that to be done, I wonder?" As she said this, she came suddenly upon an open place with a little house in it about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives there," thought Alice, "it'll never do to come upon them this size. Why, I should frighten them out of their wits." So she began nibbling at the right-hand bit again, and she did not venture to go near the house till she had brought herself down to 9 inches. End of chapter 5. Okay, so chapter 5, she's peeking up over the mushroom, and it is the blue caterpillar. And the blue caterpillar is like, "Who are you?" And Alice is like, "Well, that's a good question. I don't really know. I've changed so many times today that I'm definitely not the same person I was when I woke up." And he's like, "Changed? How have you changed?" She's like, "Well, I keep changing sizes. I'm really big, I'm really small, and I haven't been the same size for 10 minutes at a time." And he's like, "So?" And she's like, "Well, you're gonna go through a change and you're gonna feel weird." And he's like, "No, I'm not." And she's like, "You don't know that." And yes, well, maybe I would feel weird. Maybe you don't feel weird. I can't speak for you. And so he she's like, "Also, I just feel so weird, like I can't even recite things right." And he's like, "Well, recite this." And she's like, "Okay." So then she recites and she's like, "Oh, that was wrong." And he's like, "Yeah, every bit of it was wrong from start to finish." And so she's like, "Oh, I just want to be my height again." She's like, "Well, actually, it doesn't really matter what height I am. Like, I just want to stay the same height." And so the caterpillar is like, "One side will make you taller, one side will make you shorter." And he's like about to leave, and she's like, "Wait, but one side of what? What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Of the mushroom." And then he's gone. So she grabs from both sides, nibbles. She gets too large. Her neck is up into the trees, and a pigeon is well, she gets too small. She gets far too small. And then she gets too large. And a pigeon is just smacking her around, thinking that she's a serpent and trying to take her eggs. And she's like, "I'm not a serpent. I'm a little girl." And she's like, "Well, you look like a serpent. Serpents have been eating my eggs and all of these things." And like the pigeon is saying, like, "I tried to go to the tallest branch on the tree to get away, and here we are." And she's like, "Well, I'm a little girl. But little girls also eat eggs." Like she keeps doing that. Like she did that with Dinah to be like, "Oh, Dinah loves to eat mice." "Well, serpents eat eggs." And she's like, "Well, I don't want your eggs. They're raw." And so she's nibbling both pieces of the mushroom to get down to her regular size. And she's at her regular size and she's starting off on her journey because now that she's regular size, she's like, oh, I need to go to the garden. But she comes upon a home and she knows that she can't go to the home the size that she is now. So she's nibbling a piece of the mushroom and she keeps nibbling until she gets to 9 inches. And that's where the chapter ended. This book is so silly. It's like a little palate cleanser, a little breather after all of the doom and gloom we've been reading lately. All right. Chapter 6. Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two, she stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery came running out of the house. She considered him to be a footman because he was in livery, otherwise, judging by his face only, she would have called him a fish, and rapped loudly at the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery, with a round face and large eyes like a frog, and both footmen, Alice noticed, had powdered hair and curled all over their heads. She felt very curious to know what it was all about, and crept a little way out of the wood to listen. The fish footman began by producing from under his arm a great letter, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman repeated in the same sullen voice, only changing the order of the words a little. "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." Then they both bowed low, and their curls got entangled together. Alice laughed so much at this that she had to run back into the wood for fear of their hearing her. And when she next peeped out, the fish footman was gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. There's no sort of use in knocking. Oh, I forgot she knocked. There's no sort of use in knocking, said the footman, and that for 2 reasons. Oh, wait, the frog is the footman? Which footman is it? The fish one was gone. Okay, so it's the frog one. Okay. Voices. So many people are talking. So many friends. Okay. "There's no sort of use in knocking," said the footman, "and that for 2 reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are. Secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or kettle had been broken to pieces. "Well, please, then," said Alice, "how am I going to get in?" "There might be some sense in your knocking," said the footman, went on, without attending to her, "if we had the door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock and I could let you out, you know." He was looking up at the sky all this time he was speaking, and this Alice thought decidedly uncivil. "But perhaps he can't help it," she said to herself. "His eyes are so very nearly at the top of his head. But at any rate, he might answer my questions. How am I going to get in?" she repeated aloud. "I shall sit here," the footman remarked, "till tomorrow." At this moment the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose and broke into pieces against one of the trees behind him. Oh, here is a picture of the fish footman handing the envelope to the frog footman. Or next day, maybe, the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened. How am I going to get in? Asked Alice again in a louder tone. Are you to get in at all? Said the footman. That's the first question, you know. It was, no doubt, only Alice did not like to be told so. It's really dreadful, she muttered to herself. The way all the creatures argue, it's enough to drive one crazy. The footman seemed to think this a great opportunity for repeating his mark, with variations. I shall sit here, he said, on and off, for days and days. But what am I to do? Said Alice. Anything you like, said the footman, and began whistling. Oh, there's no use in talking to him, said Alice desperately. He's perfectly idiotic. And she opened the door and went in. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron, which seemed to be full of soup. Oh, there's certainly too much pepper in that soup, Alice said to herself, as well as she could for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately, without a moment's pause. The only two creatures in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat, which was lying on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. Please would you tell me, said Alice, a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, why your cat grins like that? It's a Cheshire cat, said the Duchess, and that's why. Pig. She said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped. But she saw in another moment that it was addressed to the baby and not to her, so she took courage and went on. I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin. They all can, said the Duchess, and most of 'em do. I don't know any of that, do? Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. You don't know much, said the Duchess, and that's a fact. Alice did not at all like the tone of this remark, and thought it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire, and at once set to work, throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The 5 irons came first. Then followed a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. Oh, please mind what you're doing, cried Alice, jumping up and down in an agony of terror. There goes his precious nose, as an unusually large saucepan flew close by it, and very nearly carried it off. And we have a picture of the Duchess with the baby, and the cook and Alice, and the Cheshire cat. Very fun. If anybody minded their own business, the Duchess said in a hoarse growl, the world would go round a deal faster than it does. Which would not be an advantage, said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. Just think what work it would make with the day and night. You could see the earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis. Talking of axes, said the Duchess, chop off her head. Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening, so she went on again. 24 hours, I think. Or is it 12? Oh, don't bother me, said the Duchess. I never could abide figures. And with that, she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. At the end of every line, just shaking him. He only does it annoy because he knows it teases. Chorus, in which the cook and the baby joined. Wow, wow, wow. While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear the words. Speak severely to my boy. I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases. Chorus. Wow, wow, wow. Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like, the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke. I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen. And she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was an odd-shaped little creature, and held out its arms and legs in all directions. Just like a starfish, thought Alice. The poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine when she caught it, and kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether, for the first minute or two, it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it up into a sort of knot, and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot so as to prevent its undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. If I don't take this child away with me, thought Alice, they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind? She said the last words out loud, and the little thing grunted in reply. It had left off sneezing by this time. Don't grunt, said Alice. That's not at all a proper way of expressing yourself. The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt that it had a very turn-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. But perhaps it was only sobbing, she thought, and looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear, said Alice seriously, I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now. The poor little thing sobbed again, or grunted, it was impossible to say which, and they went on for some while in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, now what am I to do with this creature when I get it home? When it grunted again so violently that she looked down into its face in some alarm. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig, and she felt that it would be quite absurd for her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. If it had grown up, she said to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child. But it makes rather a handsome pig, I think. And she began thinking over other children she knew, who might do very well as pigs. And she was just saying to herself, if one only knew the right way to change them, when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting on a bough of the tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt that it ought to be treated with respect. Cheshire, she began, rather timidly, as she did not at all know whether it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, and she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. Oh, I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't really matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. What sort of people live about here? In that direction, the cat said, waving its right paw round, lives a hatter, and in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad. But I don't want to be among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. Well, you must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice didn't think that proved it at all. However, she went on. And how do you know that you're mad? To begin with, said the cat, a dog's not mad. You grant that? Oh, I suppose. Well, then, the cat went on, you see, a dog growls when it's angry, and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now I growl when I'm pleased, and wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I'm mad. I call it purring, not growling. Here are pictures. Before we change the page of Alice and the Cheshire, both pages. Call it what you like, said the cat. Do you play croquet with the Queen today? Oh, I should like it very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited yet. Well, you'll see me there, said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not much surprised at this. She was getting so well used to odd things happening. While she was still looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. By the by, what became of the baby? Said the cat. I'd nearly forgotten to ask. It turned into a pig, Alice answered very quietly, just as if the cat had come back in a natural way. I thought that it would, said the cat, and vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting to see it, but it did not appear, and after a minute or two she walked on in the direction in which the March hare was said to live. I've seen hatters before, she said to herself. The March hare will be much the most interesting, and perhaps as this is May it won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March. That makes sense. As she said this, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on a branch of a tree. Did you say pig or fig? Said the cat. I said pig, replied Alice, and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat is the most curious thing I ever saw in my life. She had not gone much farther before she came in sight of the house of the March Hare. She thought it must be the right house, because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go near till she had nibbled some more of the left-hand bit of mushroom, and raised herself to about 2 feet high. Even then she walked up towards it rather timidly, saying to herself, suppose it wouldn't be raving mad after all. I almost wish I'd gone to see the Hatter instead. End of chapter 6. All right, so Alice has left the dog and she's at the house and she shrinks herself down, and when she arrives, she sees a fish footman hand a frog footman a letter. It's an invitation to the Duchess to play croquet with the Queen. And so she stops and has a little conversation with the frog footman about how to get in. She like knocks on the door, nobody hears her. All she can hear is like sneezing and wailing and like banging of like pots and pans. And so they go back and forth, and the frog footman, of course, is not very helpful. He's like, I think I'm just gonna sit here for a day or two. Maybe more, I haven't decided. And so she goes in and she sees the Duchess sitting holding a baby, and there's a cook looking around, and there's just too much pepper in the soup. There's too much pepper in the air, and it's just making people sneeze randomly. And the Duchess is like holding onto this baby and like shaking the baby, and nobody's really concerned over the safety of this baby. I mean, I can't do anything about this, but it's a safety issue. And Alice is also very concerned. And so they're singing along, and then the Duchess is like, I have to get ready to go play croquet. So she throws the baby at Alice for Alice to take care of, and Alice like rewraps the baby up and like takes the baby outside so that it can get fresh air. And as she's doing so, she's like, oh, well, what am I gonna do with this baby when I get home? I don't know what to do with this baby. And as she's doing that, the baby starts like grunting, and she's like, baby, it's not how you behave. And the baby keeps grunting, and the nose is turning more and more upward, and the eyes are getting smaller and smaller, and the baby turns into a pig. And Alice is like, well, as a baby, you were kind of ugly, but as a pig, you're rather handsome. And then the Cheshire Cat appears. We saw him in the house of the Duchess, but now he's outside on a branch. And she's talking with the Cheshire Cat and was like, so where am I supposed to go? And the Mad Hatter is like, well, you can go wherever you want to go. Like, we're all mad here. And she's like, well, I'm not. And he's like, yes, you are. And so he's like, over this way is the Mad Hatter. Over this way is the March Hare. It really depends on like where you want to go. And he also asks if Alice is going to go play croquet with the Queen. And Alice is like, well, I haven't been invited, but I would like to. That sounds wonderful. And so the Cheshire Cat disappears and then reappears and is like, by the way, what happened to the baby? And Alice is like, oh, the baby turned into a pig, and then disappears and then reappears and was like, did you say pig or did you say fig? And Alice is like, I said pig, and please stop vanishing so quickly. So then the Cheshire Cat vanishes very slowly, and I think that's hilarious. And then all you just see is like the smile. And so Alice is going towards the March Hare and is like, well, maybe the March Hare isn't going to be so mad because it's not even March, you know? It's May. Yes, I hope you have a fantabulous evening. So yes, that is going to be it for tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a pleasure. I figured that we should do a little bit of an absurdist reading, just to, cleanse the palate ever so gently. So yes, we will finish this next time, and then we will start on Through the Looking Glass, the time after that, looking deep into the future. So, yes. Have a good evening, everybody. Have a good night. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. Goodbye.